This passage is about neoliberalism, the author's criticism of neoliberalism, especially in the context of India. Okay, let's quickly look at the passage, note down the main points before we look at the questions and answers. After the disintegration of the Soviet Union, some proclaimed that there was no alternative to neoliberalism. Since then, the so-called triumphant march of neoliberal capitalism has seen many hurdles, such as the 2008 financial crisis. The worst victims of this march and its consequent crisis has been the disadvantaged sections. Neoliberalism has been on the rise since the fall of the Soviet Union. But the author says that the so-called triumphant march, that means the author doesn't believe that neoliberalism has really been effective, has seen many problems. There's been the financial crisis and other such crises since neoliberalism started its ascent. And the people who've been worst affected by it have been the disadvantaged sections, the poorer sections. This shows the presence of class conflict in society. Needless to say, the vulnerabilities of the disadvantaged are a creation of capitalism itself. He says the fact that the disadvantaged section is suffering the most shows that the society has a division. There's a class conflict in society. Second point, he says that the vulnerability, the disadvantaged are vulnerable and weak because of the creation of capitalism itself. Capitalism itself is the cause of the weakness and vulnerabilities of the disadvantaged section. The French economist Thomas Piketty exposes the essence of neoliberalism. He says, this is what neoliberalism is all about, which leads to unprecedented inequalities and disparities. So Thomas Piketty, the French economist, has exposed neoliberalism. He says, at its core, neoliberalism is such that it leads to unprecedented, never before seen inequalities and disparities, divisions, differences. In the Indian context, liberalization of the economy was initiated on the premise that the seemingly socialist and centrally planned economy had outlived its utility, and that private ownership and market forces would efficiently replace public sector undertakings and provisions. So he said, in India, when we started liberalization of the economy, it was on the premise that, we started it on the basis of the fact that the seemingly socialist, that means it wasn't exactly totally socialist, and centrally planned economy had outlived its utility. It is not going to benefit us anymore. Therefore, we need to let private forces, market forces, private ownership should replace this centrally planned economy, should replace public sector undertakings and provisions. Such an opening up of the economy was also tried in other parts of the world, with only one consequence. So India liberalized its economy. This policy of opening up the economy was also taken up in other parts of the world. And the result was the same. He said, what was that? Unprecedented concentration of wealth in the hand of a few and a marked shift in the actual centers of power. What happened? Did it benefit the society as a whole? No. What happened is there was concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, of a nature that we'd never seen before. Unprecedented. There was no precedent or example of this kind of concentration of wealth. Also, the balance of power, the center of power shifted. All right, the people who are powerful were different now in this new liberalized economies than the earlier power centers. Crony capitalism was soon making its fast inroads into the policy-making coteries of India. What happened? Crony capitalism, he calls it, shows the author's contempt, right? It was making fast inroads. It was getting into the policy-making coteries, the circles. Centers of power are called, a coterie is basically a group with an agenda, a politically strong group. So the policy-making groups in India, those bodies can be called coteries. So it said that the policy-making coteries of India had also got this idea of capitalism. this newfound confidence of the private sector bore fruits. But for whom? Whom did this benefit? He said, definitely not for the masses, as shown in a recent study that named India as the second most unequal society in the world. So in India, what happened? Policy makers, the centers of policy making in India were influenced by capitalism. And as a result, what happened? What happened, according to the author, is it did not benefit the masses because it led to inequalities, and India is the second most unequal society in the world. According to the Credit Suisse Research Institute's Global Wealth Report, 1% of the Indian population owns 51.5% of the wealth in the country, and the top 10% own about 3/4 of the wealth. So basically, wealth is concentrated in the hands of a small percentage of people. On the other hand, the bottom 60%, the majority of the population, owns 4.7% of the total wealth. So you see the inequality. Public education, and now this is as far as concentration of wealth and power are concerned. Next, look at the other consequence of liberalization. Public education and health are the most affected by capitalism. Educational spending by the center has been showing a downward trend. The center has been spending less on education. 6.15 in 2014-15 budget to 3.17 in 17-18 budget. So you see the cut in allocation of funds for education, 6.15 to 3.71. Instead of expanding higher education horizontally to more far-flung areas of the country and vertically to the disadvantaged sections of the society. So instead of education expanding horizontally and vertically, what has happened? Spending, allocation of budget, funds in the budget for education has been cut down. The central government is allowing, instead of expanding higher education both vertically and horizontally, what is the central government doing? It's allowing the higher education financing agency to allow the private sector to dominate the education sector and make higher education a distant dream for the deprived classes. So what has happened now? Instead of the government expanding education horizontally and vertically, education has also gone into private hands. And because of this, he says, higher education has become a distant dream for the deprived classes. Similarly, in the health sector, the government has chosen private insurance companies and private healthcare lobbies as its partners, effectively taking away the attention from public infrastructure and its upgradation. So it has not upgraded public health infrastructure. It has taken the attention away from public health infrastructure and gone into private partnerships with private agencies and healthcare agencies. In a country like India, which is plagued with social problems such as widespread poverty, a deepening agricultural crisis, a very high unemployment rate, and abysmal health indicators, very low or poor abysmal health indicators, giving away public sector assets to private players and shifting the discourse away from socialism would prove fatal to a vast majority of the population. So look at the author's harsh words. He says, in a country where there is so much poverty, there's so much social problems, you are giving away state assets to private hands. And when you do that, the consequences are going to be very grave. For whom? A vast majority of the population, which is economically disadvantaged. India is doing badly on many parameters. We are not doing great on many fronts, on many factors. Nutrition, peace, human development, press freedom. While a section of the media is celebrating improvement in the ease of doing business index, he says we are lagging in so many areas, and here the press is celebrating the ease of doing business index in India. In other words, and this is the author's conclusion, ensuring that people live a decent life is subordinate or inferior to ensuring that business becomes easy for crony capitalists. Again, he has used the word crony capitalists. According to the author, the Indian government has involved the private sector in health and education in a big way because why has the Indian government made health and education or moved more towards private players in health and education? That's what the author is asking. The author has, in the passage, the author has mentioned at 2 places. We have to see in a sentence what does that mean. It genuinely feels that the public sector apparatus for health and education cannot be upgraded. Is this anything that is implied in the passage? Does the government believe that the health and education in the public sector cannot be upgraded? Has it said that the public sector has failed in upgrading the health and education? No, author hasn't said that. Author just said liberalization happened, and when liberalization happened, government in doing its neoliberal policies has moved heavily towards private players. It didn't tell us because it felt public sector cannot upgrade itself. So this is our assumption, not correct. It does not have sufficient allocation in its budget to ensure education and health for all. Did it say that? He just said budget allocations for health and education has come down. But he didn't say it did not have sufficient allocation. It does not have sufficient allocation, and that's why it's given it to the private players. Because it is giving it to the private players, it is not spending enough money, not the other way around. Therefore, this is not the right answer. Its decision-making ability has been taken over by close business associates. Is it because business people have just there was this business coup over the government? Has he said government is totally powerless, businesses have taken over? No, that's an extreme statement. It is the government's intention to formulate and implement neoliberalist policies. Neoliberalist policy, liberalization of the economy. Liberalization of the economy happened in India, happened in other countries because they thought socialist system has outlived its utility. But what happened instead was wealth got concentrated in the hands of a few. But the government has gone into this private opening up the economy because it is moving away from the socialistic pattern, seemingly socialistic pattern as the author calls it, to opening up its economy towards a more liberal kind of economy. Therefore, it wants to implement this neoliberal policies, and that is why neoliberal policies is where private enterprise and market forces take over. All right, so the answer is D.